Welcome to the Happily Family Conference. We are your hosts. I'm Cecilia Hilkey.
And I'm Jason Hilkey.
And we are delighted today to have Dr. Joseph Lee with us. Dr. Lee is a psychiatrist with a practice in Southern California. Early in his practice, he saw that his patients were clearly getting better, but didn't seem to be quite well. His search to help people truly thrive led him to a truth-based perspective that he's been applying personally and professionally, built around developing self-worth, meaningful relationships, and lifelong optimal healthiness. Becoming a parent helped make him more intentional about every aspect of his own life, trying to figure out the best way to raise his kids while maintaining his own health and well-being. Dr. Lee presents mental healthiness classes to the community, and he's presented at UXPA and the Headspace headquarters on the role of empathy on user design. Welcome, Dr. Lee. It's great to have you here.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me again.
Absolutely. It's great to talk to you again. We always enjoy these conversations. And I want to just first say that we know Joey and we've talked to Joey a lot, and I may call you Joey instead of Dr. Lee, and I hope that's okay.
No problem.
Because I don't think I could actually get Dr. Lee to come out naturally.
Yeah,
I think I'll
use me also if you did.
Okay, I just wanted to get that out of the way.
Okay,
so I don't
good.
just say Joey
That
and people are like,
cleared the
who's
air.
Joey?
Right.
Okay. So I wanted you to start, and now I'm going to call you Joey too, with what's unique about us as humans versus animals, per se.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the interesting ways that I like to talk about how we think about our unique experience as human beings. And one of them is if you kind of even start from a biological perspective, there are unique things that make us as human beings different. And those unique qualities very much sort of like determine our unique human experience. So there was these studies, I think we ended up having this conversation. So there was this researcher doing like comparative biology, and she was able to develop a technique where she was studying different brains of different animal species. And I guess when you get into categories of animal species, you find that like all birds have very similar brains, and all dogs have similar brains. And so all apes have similar brains. And it turns out that in her way of doing this technique, that as human beings, we don't belong in this like unique category of human brains. We actually have ape brains. So we belong in the category of apes. So our brains are like that. However, that being said, you know, this is sort of then the beginning of the question. Okay, so if we have just normal, typical ape brains like gorillas and chimpanzees, you know, aren't we still somehow special? And so the two things that have been found subsequent to that, or that people know that is unique about the human brain is that one, including in her, this same researcher's study, it's Susanna Herculano Huzel. She also has a TED Talk on this exact topic. What she did find is that we actually have a super high number of neurons. So even though we have ape brains, we have like the biggest possible ape brains. And so a lot of that real estate is in our prefrontal cortex, like our frontal lobe. And that starts to define some of the things that actually do make us unique. That extra real estate gives us extra abilities. Things that we are, I think, kind of familiar with, that we talk about a lot in parenting. You know, we have a lot more nuanced emotional experiences. We have a higher capacity for empathy. Our ability to have critical thinking is a lot more complex. We can think a lot more abstractly. Our ability to kind of make sense of time in terms of the past, the present, the future is a lot more sophisticated. Our ability to just like suppress and control our emotions is actually much more sophisticated, which is good, you know, when our minds can kind of decide that something might be really hard or challenging, but at the same time, we can overcome some of our frustration and fear and do it anyways if we decide it's important. So that's one of the things that makes us sort of mentally unique in terms of our capacity to regulate our emotions. And then that in itself is also one of the unique aspects of having a highly developed sort of prefrontal cortex, is the ability for us to manage and regulate and exert influence and control over the rest of our brain, the emotional centers, our memories, our bodies. is also, we have a higher capacity for that. So that's one. We have this area of our brain that is a lot larger, and then we have all these sort of like unique human abilities that are a lot more sophisticated. And then the second component that's found is also can be sort of validated by some biological studies. There was another researcher that I came across, Ada Gomez Robles. So she did this study where she compared chimpanzee and human brains, mature ones, adult brains. And so what she found, and I think this will sort of guide a lot of our conversation here today, is that when you look at mature chimpanzee brains, they all kind of look the same in terms of their sort of like similarities and functionings. But when you look at mature adult human brains, what you find is that there's a lot more variability between different adult brains. And that what that really suggests is that for chimpanzees, you know, how their brains mature and develop is a lot more biologically and genetically determined. And that's why there's this consistency in their maturity versus what we experience as human beings. The reason why we have so much variability is because our experiences, more than our genetics, sort of really shape how our brains develop over the course of our lifetime. So in summary, you know, what makes human beings unique, you know, one is that our brains are capable of a lot more. And I kind of went down some of those qualities and features. And two, much more so than a lot of other sort of animals and species, the experiences of our life really, really shape, you know, our thinking, our behavior, our beliefs. And you can end up seeing that sort of ends up creating a lot of variability from person to person in terms of what we experience, what we learn, and what we believe in our lifetime.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I'm glad that I guess our brains are a little bit different than apes because we like to think of ourselves as being special as humans.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of, in a very practical sense, of like some of the research that's been done on the taxi drivers of London.
Right.
They have like a huge area of their brain, much more than in other healthy, typical adults, devoted to spatial memory. And then once they retire, that area shrinks down. So we can really see how their experience, their work experience in this example, makes a big difference in their brain.
Right.
So then what I understand that you're saying is that one of the two things that distinguishes us from a lot of ape brains is that if I were to just generalize and say nurture versus nature, we're more on the nurture side of things as far as our brain development goes, where a lot of apes are more on the nurture side, the nature side of the development of their brains. So is that accurate in what you're saying?
Yeah, I think, well, first, we are shaped by nurture and nature. So that's one. It's not either or, but we are shaped by both. So genetics, DNA, especially when we're talking about like child adolescent development, you know, a lot of that is predetermined on the biological side in terms of like, let's say, developmental milestones, what you expect to happen at puberty, what you expect to happen through a normal sort of childhood and a normal adolescence. However, what we're also saying is that the impact of nurture, the relationships, our experiences, what we believe, how we think, what we're exposed to, so that's all part of that nurture side of the equation. In the human experience, you know, that is so much more heavily weighted, you know, so it's nurture and nature, but for us, the nurture side is pretty impactful. It's pretty huge.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I didn't say that very well. The follow-up that I have to that is what I'm also hearing is that, is that then that our brains are also, they have more plasticity, or we have more plasticity longer than the chimpanzee or than the ape brain does. Is that the findings of this as well?
Yeah, I think that's one of the findings, and very specifically, you know, the area that we kind of know is the most plastic in the human brain is the memory centers. So, you know, our memories are constantly sort of expanding, and I think one of the ways in which you kind of link the different aspects of what I said is unique about human is that we have such a ability to think in complex and nuanced ways, and that kind of really affects our sort of core beliefs, so that, you know, practically when we are talking about reshaping memories or changing our memories, it actually does have a lot of sort of downstream specific effects then in very complex ways regarding what we believe, what feels natural to us, how we expect things to happen, you know, for us in the future. It all, you know, it starts with like memory remodeling, but because it's filtered through all of our sort of like higher, complex, sophisticated other sort of mental functions, it ends up having a lot of sort of meaningful and complex impact upon, you know, everything after the fact. But it does kind of start with the highly flexible way in which we kind of remember things.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
That's
So
very insightful for me.
We just got really deep, and I'm wanting to connect this conversation a little bit to parenting, so we don't, so we can help it be a little bit practical.
We are talking about the heart and science of parenting for this conference. This is the science.
Heavy into the science.
Yes.
I'm not familiar with the term memory remodeling and some of the things that you were talking about there. Is there an example in parenting of like, why should I care? I'm the average parent.
So, okay, so let's start with like a typical childhood like memory that gets revised and remodeled over time, which is, let's say, the belief in Santa Claus. Okay, so spoiler alert, Santa Claus is not real, but there's a period of time where most kids and us currently as adults, time in our own lives, where we had these beliefs that Santa Claus is real. And in our minds, you know, based on that memory of, you know, seeing these cartoons and that guy at the mall and the presents under the chimney, there's all this like evidence for us that Santa Claus, of course he's real, right? And then somewhere along the way, some older sibling, some older kid, somebody confronts us with this thing that we didn't even know we were not supposed to believe. Like, oh, you believe in Santa Claus? And the kid's like, what? What do you mean believe in Santa Claus? But that sort of like question or that challenge starts a process where that, you know, 7-year-old kid starts to wonder based on this new information. And then it kind of starts to reshape that belief where that kid's like, wait, what? Santa Claus is, what do you mean not real? And starts asking questions, starts scrutinizing things like, yeah, that's weird that, you know, that Santa Claus who should be so busy at this time of year is like visiting the Puente Hills Mall. And, you know, and I always wondered why and how he manufactured video games in the North Pole. And then all of a sudden, because of some inquiry and some question, this whole belief starts to unravel, right? And then you revise your beliefs, and then it has to do with and then now that gets like stored in your memories, and Santa Claus is a good example because we usually don't go backwards. Once we have like new information that revises what we think and understand and perceive, you know, we don't like then as 28-year-olds go back and like, you know what, I'm rethinking that Santa Claus, you know, like once that happens, it gets reshaped, and then you kind of see, and it automatically, because of new beliefs, it reshapes what we expect. So that kid maybe for one more year is going to like pretend that they don't know to their parents that they still believe in Santa Claus, hoping to get 2 presents from their parents for 1 year. But eventually that thing falls apart, right? So that's an example how like new experiences shape new memories, and then that's kind of what I meant earlier. It kind of then starts to unfold after the fact, and that affects our beliefs, and then affects our choices, our expectations, and our behaviors.
Great.
That makes more sense as like a kid-centric sort of example of all that science stuff.
Yeah, and it just points to the neuroplasticity that we have as humans, that our brain is constantly learning new information and creating new information throughout our entire lifetime.
Right.
So we've talked a lot about how experience shapes our brain, whether it's experience of Santa Claus and presents under the Christmas tree, or experience of being a taxi cab driver. But what about emotions? let's talk about how emotions shape brain.
Yeah, so I think, and this can sort of link to memory as well. So what we know is that our early life experiences, prior to what we call explicit memory. So explicit memory is the kind of memory that you and I can like retrieve and recall. I remember last year when I went on that vacation, and we can like pull memories. That's explicit memory. Then we have things called implicit memories, which are things we absolutely remember in a meaningful way, but we can't ever be aware of those memories. And so implicit memories are stored in a different part of the brain, in the limbic system, in the amygdala, which is different than all the other memory stuff that we just talked about, which is the hippocampus, which we just said is very plastic and changeable throughout our lifetime. The reason why that's important is the limbic system, our amygdala, it's all related to the origin of a lot of our basic and core emotional processing. And so you kind of see this link in the anatomy, at least in the human brain, between implicit memories, emotional processing, and it's related to early childhood because, that part of the brain, we kind of are more developed. And so a lot of our early life experiences are sort of foundationally kind of determined that by that part of our brain. And so early life experiences, specifically relational experiences, our attachments to our caregivers, and the feelings that come out of that era of our life. Do we feel safe? Which would in many ways be an absence of fear or anxiety. Do we feel secure? Do we feel comfortable? Do we feel loved? Do we feel known? Do we feel understood? These are all sort of feelings that are stored and remembered implicitly, right? In these early years of our life. And if all of those kind of core attachment needs are met, we feel safe, we feel secure, we feel seen, we feel soothed, which are kind of the 4 S's of attachment psychology. And that's kind of like sets up a lot of sort of positive things for the rest of our life. Now, the interesting thing is, we don't explicitly remember, like those first 4 or 5 years of our life. None of us can specifically recall in the same way that we can recall the details of last year's vacation. We can't recall the details of, being held in our mother's arms, in the first year of our life or whatever. However, our brain does remember all of those experiences, and those specific memories kind of really set us up for a lot of lifelong healthiness and well-being if all of those core needs are met. And interestingly, those needs being met also sort of help determine how healthily our brain develops in our prefrontal cortex as well, which is all those other more eventual, sophisticated, adult, mature functions. And so there's definitely this relationship. And as I mentioned earlier, our emotional processing, our emotional regulation, our emotional insight eventually does come from that part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And you kind of see this relationship that having positive emotional and relational experiences early in life end up being a very sort of, it kind of greases the wheels for us to kind of also then develop more sophisticated sort of emotional insights and emotional processing for the rest of our life as well.
Super. So I want to put that in like street language because some of this stuff is even new to me. Basically what you're saying is those early childhood experiences and the feelings about them help not just develop the emotional parts of our brain, but they help develop the prefrontal cortex, those really very special human parts of our brain.
Yeah. To be able to better process what we come across as we get older, how we process emotions, decision-making, stress, things like that. It sort of creates these roadmaps or these pathways for us to be able to handle those in a healthy, a mental healthy kind of way, is what I understand you're saying. And I'm wondering, does this correspond to like the Harvard Grant study? Because much of what you're saying sounds similar to what was found in that study.
Right. So, so the Harvard Grant study, which is, I think, one of the most unique and studies ever done, It was a study that's still ongoing, started in the late 1940s. There were 268 volunteers who were sophomores at Harvard. And they kind of agreed to have a battery of sort of like both physical and psychological tests performed while there were students there, with the plan is that, you know, after they left Harvard, that for a period of time, they would be followed, you know, I think once a year with surveys and once every 5 years with like face-to-face interviews. And as long as they were able to, and as long as they're willing to, they would try to, you know, follow these men as long as they could. Turns out that almost all of them remained in the study for their lifetime. So this is a unique study where the same people have been studied from the late 1940s until now. So I think it's on like the 79th year of the study or something remarkable like that. Some of these guys are still alive. And so the wealth of information that kind of comes from being able to study the same people over decades and decades and decades kind of answers a couple of sophisticated questions that you can't kind of do with like cross sections, you know, of people at different ages, because it's the same person. And so the Harvard grant study, you know, even though it has this like tons and tons and tons of rich, unique information, when you ask the main researcher, George Vaillant, he was like overseeing the study in the middle 40 years, right? And his own personal age was kind of close to a lot of these men in the study. So he has this kind of quote, you know, whenever he's asked, like, if you had to summarize all of it, you know, into like a super short, concise statement, what he says is, you know, happiness is love, full stop, right? That's his, that's his like short version of the statement. And he says that because the most unique sort of core finding, when you look at what the study attempted to measure, which is, you know, well-being through all sorts of domains in life. And so the Harvard grant study attempts to have this well-rounded picture of success and fulfillment. So they measure like lifelong happiness, physical health, how much money did you make when you retired? You know, did you have success in your career by recognition with your peers? Are you happily married? So there are like 10 categories of pretty diverse measures that kind of check all sorts of different various definitions of success: relationship, health, finance, notoriety, fame, whatever you want. And the most well-rounded sort of successful people in that study, when you look back and you said, what kind of factors were the most relevant that determined, you know, people in the most successful category, it was specifically the warmth of relationships that they experienced in their childhood, right? So more than socioeconomics, more than intelligence, more than being free of psychological disorders, more than, you know, anything else that they measured in great detail with all these guys across their lifespan, the most influential factor in their lifetime was the warmth of relationships in their childhood was most likely to determine like this path of life success. And then if you kind of were in a lower group, you know, so you weren't the most successful, in the lower third, right, the people who, you know, like graduated from Harvard in the 1940s, who you would have expected, no matter what, would have been successful. Well, there were still some people from that group that didn't do so well in life. And for them, there was a correlation to not having warm or great relationships. And then also there was like things like substance abuse. The other cool thing about the study as to why, you know, happiness is related to love in terms of his conclusion is that you took, let's say, some people who are not in that most successful group, but like average or low, and you kind of, again, followed them throughout their lifespan. What you saw in these studies is if they developed some sort of other loving, meaningful relationship at another point in life, whether it was getting married or their second marriage or having kids or something, but it was almost always a meaningful relationship that sort of then moved them from like the average course, you know, and then they kind of started like trending upwards towards the other kind of life success and fulfillment if at a point in life, not necessarily in their childhood, but later in life, they had this sort of like loving, fulfilling, meaningful relationship. Then it kind of like course corrected them back towards like optimal human experience. And so I think that that's why the Harvard grant study is one of my favorite studies. It's unique, it's huge, but I also love the conclusions. I think the conclusions are awesome. You know, it just really says that like loving, meaningful relationships either set you up great early in life, or if you can find it later in life, you also can reap the benefits as well.
Yeah. Oh, and we're fans of that same study too. So I want to apply that to, say I'm a parent that adopted a child from Ethiopia when they were 5 years old. We
Right.
know that they didn't get all that safe, secure, soothed experiences when they were in an orphanage.
Yeah.
And I want to provide that child with that early attachment stuff to the best of my ability. Once they're part of my family, can I still do that?
Yes, and I think that that's actually the encouraging part of both a lot of what we talked about so far, which is like the Harvard Grant study says, that at any time in life after that window, if you still experience that sort of sense of fulfilling, meaningful love, and that's integrated into your life, a relationship like that, then you still can get those needs met, and then you can still reap those benefits. And then the other part of what we talked about, which is that, you know, human beings, we're open to belief change our whole lives. So, you know, even if we believed, you know, for a number of years of our life that, you know, that the world was not a safe or secure place, or that people were unreliable or whatever it may be, we are still open to having transformative beliefs if we experience something later in life that says, oh, that wasn't true. What I've learned now is more true. Just like Santa Claus. Oh, that wasn't true. What I've learned now is more true. And that stays with us. And then our lives can get really redirected. And so I think that's why, you know, from a parenting perspective, you know, it's important for parents to understand that too. You know, you don't have to have perfect parenting, perfect childhood, and these sort of like perfect experiences for your kids to be perfect. It's just enough you know, they just need to have enough, you know, and those enough experiences really, really are enough.
Yeah. And we're not, the bar for enough is actually not very high.
Yeah, it's like 51%, you know, enough.
Kid have a warm relationship, and for them to feel safe and soothed and seen.
Yeah.
We're just talking about the typical things that you would do. If a baby's crying, then you pick them up, you soothe them. If they're hungry, you feed them. Like, those are how we fulfill as parents, that we have our kids feel safe and soothed and seen and secure.
And also why we encourage relationship being one of the first priorities in our parenting styles with our kids, is because relationship has such a profound effect on the long-term development of kids. So
Right. I think what we're really kind of saying is it might be the most determining effect, you know, positive relationships, right? Not just on a checklist of many things, you know, but that the warmth of relationships in your childhood is the most, you know, and if it can, and practically, I think, you know, to kind of also translate maybe even outside the first 5 years of life, you know, why that's so impactful. You know, another way of saying this idea is that, you know, one of the core beliefs that if you can kind of leave your childhood with, in terms of like, that also supports everything we're saying, is that if you believe that your life has worth, if you have a stable sense of self-worth, then I think that's really, in many practical ways, why it translates into like a healthier, thriving life. One of the ways that that stable sense of self-worth gets instilled is that, you know, you're kind of like this helpless baby in the world that depends on other people to take care of you and meet your needs. And when people show up in your life and they do that, then it makes you feel like, oh, I guess I was worth it, you know? And I think that's a sort of like on the most simple level as to why those early life experiences, because it instills that particular idea. And then you can see that translate in so many ways, from different angles as to how a stable sense of self-worth not just makes you like a more confident, self-assured person, but it also even helps you in moments of failure and suffering, you know, that in those moments when life kind of doesn't meet your needs, or you're kind of things suck and you're disappointed, you know, it's that moment where if you do believe that your life still has value, you can sort of say, wow, this is really disappointing, this is hurtful, and I'm really frustrated and I'm sad, but, you know, it's not supposed to be this way. Life has more to offer. I'm going to try again. And I think those increments are kind of like practically why people who have that stable sense of self-worth or leave their childhood with that are a lot more resilient, a lot more persistent, a lot grittier, a lot more open, you know, in the way that they approach life. And I think those little increments add up to fulfillment, you know, over time.
Yeah. So on the topic of self-worth,
Mm-hmm.
there could be parents listening to this and they're thinking, oh, okay, that's great. I'm going to give my kids some self-worth. So I'm going to tell them, hey, you're beautiful. Hey, you're smart. Hey, you know, you're great. Good job.
Right.
Is that what you're talking about? Are you talking about self-worth in kind of a different way?
I am totally not talking about what you just said. But I do think, but that's actually, that's actually the challenge, because that's actually what happened for a long time, that it was out of some of this early research that kind of sort of identified this. It wasn't quite clear. And the whole sort of self-esteem movement came out of this research maybe in the 1980s or so that said, you know, people that felt good about themselves tended to do better in life. And the self-esteem movement kind of jumped on that and kind of did exactly what you said, which is like, oh, well, if self-esteem, having good self-esteem is related to doing well in life, then we should boost everyone's self-esteem, which again, at this point is not a bad idea, and that's not wrong. It was the strategies and the implementation which became things like, okay, having good self-esteem means always feeling good about yourself, believing that you're special, believing that you're awesome. Turns out that that's actually not how you build good self-esteem. But good self-esteem is built on a stable sense of self-worth. And it's almost the opposite of feeling special. You know, a lot, you know, when we specifically look at, you know, how you instill a stable sense of self-worth, it actually has more to do with kind of saying, you know, even if I'm not special, even if I'm not perfect, even if I'm not the best, my life still has a basic value that is still worth it for people to acknowledge me, to meet my needs, you know, and then again, we come back to that I'm worth it for these people in my life to make me feel safe, make me feel secure. And it comes from this more basic humanity that we all have in common, which again is almost the opposite of the praise and the self-esteem that almost has a goal to say you are special and you are unique, you know, those kind of qualifiers. You're the prettiest, you're the smartest, you're the best. And then the other downside of that strategy is that, you know, eventually at some point kids develop self-awareness and insight to the degree that says, you know what, I know my mom and my dad and all these people tell me I'm the smartest, but, you know, I really, really know that that kid over there is smarter than me. Or that, you know, somebody thinks I'm super pretty, but I'm not really feeling pretty today. Or that other person over there is prettier than me. And then if people keep telling me those same messages, but I myself don't believe that, then you kind of start seeing how people start to compensate. And there's some thoughts, you know, and I think it's reasonable for people to kind of believe that, you know, one of the negative outcomes from the self-esteem movement is that, you know, a lot of kids who have become, you know, in their 20s now, a lot of the typical characteristics that people attribute to millennials of being sort of, you know, more superficially oriented, needing a lot of feedback and recognition, not having the same kind of self-motivation that we would hope that a lot of people would have. You know, maybe a lot of that is specifically the byproduct of parenting with a little bit too much praise and pushing people a little bit too much to try to be special and unique. So it is one of these things, especially in a conference where we're talking about parenting, that we want to be aware that there is that's not quite what we're saying when we're wanting our kids to have a positive sense of self-worth. It's not the being special and being unique. It's actually like, no matter what, you deserve to be loved, and you deserve to be seen. You deserve to be understood. And all people deserve that, including you. And it's more of the universal message of self-worth that we all have, that we all possess.
Okay, so what can I do as a parent when I want to go and praise my kid and tell them that they're smart and pretty? What can I do instead?
I think so it's not like you want to just like withhold being positive from your kids. I think, and as specific as you can often be sometimes, instead of generic, right? I think that a lot of things that are more variable as opposed to fixed are things worth recognizing. Like we talk about effort, recognizing effort, because an effort is something that's very self-determined, how much effort you can put in, versus, things that are fixed, at least we think are fixed, like how smart you are, how pretty you are. A person can't feel that they can control that sometimes, So I think, the more specific we can be in recognizing effort or certain accomplishments or growth, those kinds of things are good. I think there is a delicate balance. I don't think we have to be so withholding of never telling positive things to our kids. And I think that's, I understand the nature of the question, because I get it too from different people asking, like, you get so cautious about not wanting to overpraise that you end up like withholding, which I don't think is the goal either. But I do think the more specific you can be regarding effort, accomplishment, growth, there's a lot of positivity that you can still acknowledge and be supportive and celebrate with in those moments too.
Yeah. And I think we're talking about Carol Dweck's book. Yeah. And her work around mindset and developing a growth mindset. She's a great resource too.
Yeah, I was just going to give a nod towards that as well. It's just, that's kind of what a lot of this is coming from. And then I also catch myself in wanting to be excited with my kids when something happens, and I've gone through that cycle up and down of like, oh, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to praise. And then there's other times when I'm like over the top, and I recognize what that has, but trying to find that middle ground and still being authentic as myself, because my kids will know. They see through it all, but being authentic with them, and I can be excited with them and still pray and still acknowledge the effort, the work, all of that piece of it. The variable piece is that's what I've learned to do over the time, and continue to learn and work on.
You can appreciate good choices, appreciate good strategies.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that some and I think there was probably there probably is some people that are probably overly cautious on the like don't praise and overpraise, and unfortunately sometimes that turns into like the absence of recognition. So I do think that there is a balance that we want to strike, and just in terms of talking about the nuances of critical thinking, it's not always true that if you've identified something that's not good, it doesn't mean that the opposite of that all the way on the other end of the spectrum is good. So I think we're not saying that, if overly praising your kids is not genuinely good for their self-esteem, then you should be like the opposite of that in terms of being withholding or only point out, when they need to grow more or try harder. That's not what we're saying. But it is specifically, we're just saying like, focusing too much on trying to make them feel good about themselves because they're special and unique and the best. That's the specific trap we're trying to avoid.
Try to keep that pendulum from swinging too far the other direction at this point.
Right, exactly. And I think that there's been some of that, and I think so just to kind of also make that point that we're not saying that the opposite is good. Right?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So what impact does parenting have on something like other struggles with mental health, like addiction?
Mm-hmm. So, so my background before, venturing into these other things like parenting and education and my background is, I'm a therapist, I'm a psychiatrist. And so, mental illness and mental health is sort of specifically my profession day in, day out. And even in my own professional training, you know, especially as a psychiatrist, you know, there is a lot of this emphasis on the biological aspects of mental health and mental illness. There's this whole sort of body of research, which is unfortunately poorly named. They call it expressed emotion. But the idea is that when you examine not necessarily the individual, but you examine their core relationships and their support groups. And having a high EE environment in research means that your primary caregivers have a lot of negativity towards that person. There's a lot of criticism, there's hostility, they view that person as a burden. Having a low EE family environment means, despite the fact that that person has a psychiatric diagnosis, that person primarily talks about their loved one, the caregiver does, with warmth or in generally positive ways. Okay, so you have these two scenarios: high EE, which is hostile, critical, and then you have low EE, which is basically warm. And what the research finds in every single major diagnosis in psychiatry, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, substance abuse, eating disorders, ADHD, all of them, that having a high EE environment leads to all the bad outcomes that we want to avoid in psychiatry. And having a low EE environment basically has almost all the positive outcomes you would hope for. And so, and these are not small effects, you know, these are effects that are actually tend to be larger than medication effects. So, and so the idea is that, you know, one of the most positively influential things you can do for someone who is like struggling with a mental illness is work on the quality of relationships they have in the primary relationships of their life. And that actually affects, you know, relapse rates, hospitalizations, compliance with medication, how effective medication is, how much medication you take, whether or not you outgrow certain symptoms. You know, for example, the EE studies, the express emotion studies, you know, we know about 1/3 of people outgrow ADHD, you know, by the time they hit their 20s. One of the most influential factors looking back as to what might put you in the group where you outgrow ADHD is having a low EE family. You know, the number of hospitalizations, you know, over the course of a lifetime, you know, in schizophrenia is determined by EE. You know, the number of mood episodes in bipolar disorder, you know, and these factors are again 5-fold to 10-fold. You know, so these are huge effects. And this is all completely related to very much the conversation we're having, the warmth of relationships or negative relationships. And this determines like a lifelong course of mental illness or mental health. And so I find that like so fascinating. And it's something I do try to integrate actually into my practice and my therapy practice, is to kind of really weigh, you know, how, again, this nurture versus nature conversation we're having, you know, that even if we're talking about things that we normally think of being so biological in nature, like mental illness, that even there, the more impactful things when we talk about quality of life, being symptom-free, a lot of it has to do with the quality of relationships. And it's backed by, you know, this giant body of research where people study these things.
So I want to think about what parents might be, how they might want to respond to this. Are you saying that if you're not a warm parent, that you can cause your child to have a mental illness? Or are you saying that if your child has a mental illness and you are a warm parent, that's like the best antidote?
I think it's the latter. I think the latter. And we're talking about in the context of somebody has something going on, then one of the most positively influential things that you can do for your kid is to have a warm, supportive, loving relationship where their self-worth is not determined by this diagnosis or their treatment or if they take meds or anything like that, that predominantly that the relationship still is seen as a warm relationship. And that's really the difference between high EE and low EE. It's kind of like the identity that the person takes on. You know, in that sort of hostile, negative environment, that person is seen as like a patient or a burden. And it's a kind of sort of almost like a dehumanized sort of identity. Versus, you know, the warm relationship means that even though this person has a diagnosis of ADHD, bipolar, or substance abuse, or whatever it may be, that they're still seen as, you're my son, you're my daughter, you know, you're my spouse, like the primary identity is still your main sort of relationship. And I think that that's really, you know, maybe a more nuanced way to really describe what we're really talking about, and the powerful influence that really is the theme of, I think, what we're still talking about, you know, in this whole conversation, which is the powerful impact of meaningful and warm relationships.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that's what I hear in so much that we're saying is the power of warm parenting.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I feel like we could just talk
We could.
so long with Jody.
I want to sum it up by a sentence that was in Alfie Kohn's book, Unconditional Parenting. He says something like that our love for the child is undimmed by what they do.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's really what we're talking about here, that we have an unconditional love, whether they have a diagnosis or not, whether they behave the way that we want them to or not, that we continue to have a really warm relationship understanding so that they feel seen, that they feel safe with us, that they feel soothed when they're upset, and that they feel secure.
And I feel like we kind of hit these like parting thoughts here as we're wrapping up about, you know, how important warm parenting is. But I want to give you a chance, if there is something that you want to have, just like as a you know, a takeaway, or, you know, leaving people with an ask, or something that you want to you know, wrap up the conference with. I'm going to give you a moment to say something.
Well, I do think in the language that I use too, I do try to use that idea of a warm relationship, because, you know, we've today talked in a lot of specific detail what those maybe constituents of a warm relationship would be. But in general, we do mean, like, in the normal language, a warm relationship, which means connected and loving and supportive, and it feels good. So, you know, we spend a lot of time, and I personally enjoy this, you know, talking about the science and the research and the validity and the truthfulness of all of it. And oftentimes, you know, I spend some time with people talking about those things, just so that we can trust that, even though at the end of the day, what we're really talking about feels very sort of like woo-woo, you know, about the idea that the, like, having loving and warm relationships is the key. And that's part of why I enjoy and I encourage people to think about some of the science and the research, because I think it makes us more readily accept that what we're doing is true. But in practice, what we're still talking about is very sort of relatable. It's very human. It's what I think a lot of well-intentioned parents want to do anyways. And so I think that's the encouragement, which is that, you know, we can get bogged down, we can read books, and we can attend online conferences, and we can want to learn all these details of what to do. But I think for me, the reason why I enjoy talking about in the context of the warmth of relationships is because in many ways, I think that does capture the simple idea of the best thing that we can do. And I think it trickles down from that. If we can be warm in our relationships, if our kids can feel warmth in their relationships, if they can eventually look back upon their childhood and say, you know, my childhood felt, you know, secure, I was loved, you know, I have a lot of fond memories, you know, in a very sort of basic, common, everyday language. That's kind of what we're talking about. That's what we're trying to do, you know, and the message really is, you know, because as human beings we are so influenced by our experiences more than our biology. It is these experiences that we're talking about that have the most impact. And I think the nice thing is, I think it's already perfectly aligned with what well-intentioned, deliberate, conscientious parents want to do anyways. And I hope that that actually is the big encouragement, that, you know, your natural inclination to want to do it in this way is actually very much perfectly aligned with what's best for your kids.
So it's basically the scientific explanation for us as parents just to follow our instinct, follow our gut.
That's what,
right. Like I said, we could talk about the science for hours and hours. And I think that's one of the wonderful things. Like, any way you look at it, from all these different angles, whether we're talking science and biology and brain imaging or philosophy or literature or instincts that we all have as parents, they all kind of point to the same message, make your kids feel loved. And I think, to keep it simple in that sense, I think that's also very encouraging.
That we had an interview with Lori Petro for this conference as well, and that's also what she essentially said as she was wrapping up. It's like, we can go through all these classes, we can go to these conferences, we can read all, but like, just trust your intuition. And I really like that. I think that helps us as parents to relax a little bit and be able to enjoy this journey of parenting and it not be something that is so stressful. But
maybe that's another point too, which is that that our parenting and our relationships just have to be enough. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be like always loving, always warm. It just has to be enough. And then like literally, if you want to put a number on it, what does it mean? I don't know, 51%, right? Like enough. So there's a lot of leeway in there to kind of still be improvising and figuring it out and messing up and and so that's the other encouragement too, that when we're talking about parenting, it's warm enough, right? So if we can add a qualifier, right? And again, there's a lot of leeway. So the pressure that oftentimes parents kind of put on themselves, I think doesn't have to be as significant as we think either. It's just loving, warmth, and enough.
That's great. Joy, how can people keep up with you? You have a lot of great stuff. We've seen a lot of your work. You've got
venture classes.
Yep, done your
read
classes.
Your blog.
So how can people follow you online and find out more about you?
I think the easiest sort of like a hub is my blog. It's mentalhealthinessblog.com. And there's sort of stuff I've written there, including much of what we've talked about today, different articles, different topics. There's a link to get signed up there to my my sort of newsletter, my mailing list, to kind of keep updated on sort of other events and other speaking things that I might be doing in the future. And if you're in the area, also has a link to my primary practice as well. So mentalhealthinessblog.com is kind of a good hub.
And the area is Los Angeles, I'll say, just so people, since we have people from around the world here.
Yeah, Los Angeles. In the
Joey,
area.
Thanks so much for your time and your insight. We so enjoy these conversations with you. Every time we sit down, I have like a new insight into some piece or part. And so thank you for this. And thank you for sharing it with everyone here at the conference. We'll talk to you again soon.
Okay. Always a pleasure. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.